Okay, good evening and welcome to a panel discussion on coal and oil transport, business boon or public liability. My name is Barbara Dudley and I will be moderating this panel. This forum is sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Portland Education Fund and the Portland branch of the American Association of University Women. The program will be taped by Metro East Community Media for rebroadcast and will be available for online viewing at the League of Women Voters of Portland website, which is lwvpdx.org. The program is supported by a grant from the Multnomah Bar Association, Multnomah Bar Foundation, excuse me. For the past 100 years, fossil fuels have been a major source of energy and an important driver of Oregon's economy and, in fact, the economy of the whole industrialized world. The use of fossil fuels has contributed to many advances in our standard of living. Yet the extraction and burning of these fuels has also contributed to environmental pollution, to health problems, and to global climate change. Today, there is a growing concern about the effects on our communities of significant increases, both current and proposed, in oil and coal transport by rail, and of industry proposals for shipping and exporting coal and oil from the Pacific Northwest, from ports here in Oregon and in Washington State. In this program, we will hear from a panel of experts who will explain some of the economic, environmental, legal, and safety issues related to coal and oil transport, and what we as residents of the Portland metro area can do to influence government action on this issue. Each panelist will speak for no more than 15 minutes, and then answer questions from each other and from the audience, and from me. During the discussion, volunteers will be passing out index cards on which audience members may write questions. Please raise your hand if you want one of those index cards. There is someone in the back who will be happy to hand them to you. We're fortunate to have four panelists who are experts on various aspects related to coal and oil transport. Robert Whelan, an economist and project director at Eco Northwest, will discuss the economics of fossil fuels. State Representative Barbara Smith Warner will review federal regulations and their effect on the content of her legislation to improve emergency responses to accidents involving hazardous materials. Fire Lieutenant and Hood River City Councilor Laurent Picard will speak about the potential hazards of oil trains and what citizens can do. And finally, Catherine Mader, president of Mader Engineering, with service on the Oregon Commission on Global Warming, the Economic Development Commission, and the Transportation Commission, will offer her perspective on the effects of coal and oil transport on both the economy and the environment. Okay, we will begin now. Our first speaker is Robert Whelan. Bob is a director and senior economist with Eco Northwest. He specializes in market research, strategic planning, financial analysis, and economic forecasting. Eco Northwest is a consulting firm which helps governments and businesses make decisions based on economic and financial analysis. And much of Bob's work is done for businesses in a wide range of industries, including manufacturing, energy production, and agriculture. Before joining Eco Northwest, Bob was a mineral economist for the state of Oregon. Bob Whelan.
Good evening. I'm going to give you some background on the economics of oil as much as it pertains to the transportation of it. First off, a few things, and some of this will be new to you. Petroleum. About half of all the oil in the United States is used to make basically one product, gasoline. A quarter of it is used to make fuel oil, which is also diesel, or home heating oil, is the same product. The remaining quarter is, half of that is jet fuel, and the rest is all these other products like asphalt, waxes, various other chemical type products. Contrary to popular belief, petroleum isn't used to make plastics. That's something that years and years ago, some newsletter in Connecticut claimed that with plastic bags were made from petroleum. It's not true. It's made out of natural gas. So that's the background of it. In Oregon, well, let me tell you the Northwest. In the Northwest, there are quite a few refineries in Washington and California. California, up until recently, was the #2 oil-producing state. Washington has produced oil in the past, but doesn't any longer, but it has refineries in the Anacortes area and down to Tacoma, and they take oil from Alaska. And the reason why that happens is because you can't export the oil outside of the United States. Some gets exported to Canada, but there's a ban on exporting crude oil. So it goes to Washington State and those refineries. And recently there's been a steady decline in Alaskan oil production. So those refineries have been supplementing it, some of it with the oil from North Dakota, which is the main subject, I think, of the oil transport issue. They also are bringing in oil from other places like Canada, British Columbia. And another interesting thing is they're starting to bring in oil, will be soon, from the National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska, which just started producing oil a few weeks ago, that the administration has now allowed oil to be produced. It's a reserve that's Barrow, Alaska. It's an area set aside by President Harding, of all people. Not my favorite president, but he set that aside as a military petroleum reserve. Let's see, other things you need to know. Oregon consumes 1 quadrillion BTUs of energy a year. 1/3 of that is petroleum-based. Another interesting thing to know is that the Oregon itself doesn't have any refineries, has never had an oil well that actually had oil in it, had some fake oil wells that they swindled investors out of, but never had oil. But Oregon does have coal. Coos Bay was the main supplier of coal to San Francisco back around the gold rush days. Washington State has coal. King County, one of its early industries was coal mining. There's coal in the hills around here. But there's the only coal consumption in the state is at the Boardman plant, Portland General Electric. That's going to close soon. And a little bit of coal that is kind of illegally consumed in the hills of Columbia County and Clackamas County. Let's see, what else can I tell you? North Dakota. North Dakota, this is an interesting topic for an economist, is North Dakota, through fracking, the Bakken oil field was developed. It always produced some oil, but there's always been a lot of oil. Let me explain something about oil. Oil, I'm a geologist also. Oil comes from fossilized algae, for the most part, marine algae. And marine algae can fossilize in sand, because you have sandy beaches, or in mud flats, and those are the not so nice beaches we know of. And so both rock types store oil and gas. And the thing is that almost all the oil we've produced up until recently has come from sandstone or limestone, highly permeable, easier to extract rocks. Shale is like a thick mud, fossilized mud. It's kind of like, it turns to slate if you under enough pressure, and it's very hard to get oil out of it. And people thought it was a crazy idea. When I was at Penn State, there was an early program started by the US government on how to get oil out of shale. And the industry thought they were crazy, but they invested in it, and that's where this oil is coming from. In North Dakota, at the Bakken field, the oil is what's called light sweet crude. It is so light you could put it almost directly into a diesel engine and run it. It's sweet, meaning it doesn't have much sulfur in it. It's very clean. Ironically, that was its problem. When they found this oil and started producing it, the price was so high, everyone was in there producing it, they suddenly realized North Dakota doesn't have much of an infrastructure to get it anywhere. There's no oil refineries in North Dakota. There were limited pipeline capacity. And at the time, and I'm only looking back 6, 7 years, 0.01% of all the oil in the United States was shipped by rail. Nobody shipped crude oil by rail. It's almost always done by truck to a pipeline to a tank farm. That's the traditional method. So all of a sudden, there became a demand for shipping by rail in North Dakota. So we went from almost 0 to about 9% of the oil being shipped by rail. Initially, that North Dakota oil went to the Gulf Coast, and the reason why was because that's where there were refineries that could handle light sweet crude. Weirdly, in the Midwest, refineries are designed for heavy oil, dirty oil, and it's built to treat that. Light sweet crude, they had to ship it to the Gulf Coast. And that worked fine, and it costs about $13 to get it there, $10 if you get it on a pipeline, but there's no capacity. Over time, things changed. On the East Coast, well, let me back up. A few years later, the price of oil in the United States started to fall relative to the rest of the world. Used to be we were about the same price as the rest of the world, but because we couldn't export, we ended up with a great oversupply of oil. Price in the United States fell to about $10 to $12 to $15 cheaper than the rest of the world. So oil refineries on the East Coast, which use Nigerian crude oil, which is also light and sweet, said, hey, we'll switch. We'll get this Bakken crude, ship it by rail through Canada or through the continental United States, and we'll refine it on the East Coast. This is a very dynamic industry. So what happens next is that the Saudis start pushing out oil, and the price of world oil dropped. Now the gap is only $3. At that level, the refineries on the East Coast, and this is very recent, last few months, are switching back to using crude, international crude from Britain, from Norway, other big oil producers. So what's North Dakota doing with it? Well, they opened up a refinery. There's a refinery in North Dakota. They also opened up a pipeline. So the amount of crude moving on rails now from North Dakota has dropped about 25% in less than a year. So that's what's going on in the background there. I can tell you a little bit about coal. Coal's a different story. Coal prices have collapsed is a really strong word. I don't like using it, but they really have collapsed. The main reason is natural gas. The price of natural gas is less than half of what it was a year ago. Natural gas is very easy to burn. You do it at home very easily. A lot simpler. It's cheaper. And natural gas is putting coal-fired electric plants out of business. Same too with nuclear. Nuclear can't even compete with cheap natural gas. There's an abundant amount of natural gas in the United States. I remember once, and I couldn't find the data for this meeting, but there was only, I think, 2 years in the last 50 that natural gas reserves in the United States actually fell. 2 years ago, somebody told me, who was in this industry, said, when we find natural gas, we plug the well because we only want oil, because there's no market for it. It's just that cheap. So that's what's happening. So the price of coal has just simply gone down a lot.
Thank you, Bob. That was incredibly useful background. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Oregon State Representative Barbara Smith Warner. Barbara represents House District 45, which includes Northeast Portland, City of Maywood Park, and the Park Rose area. She serves on the House Committees on Revenue and Rules and the Education Subcommittee of Ways and Means. In 2015, Barbara championed the passage of a bill to establish an oil transportation safety officer position in the state fire marshal's office, which will coordinate training and resources to prepare local entities to respond should an incident occur involving rail transport of crude oil. And so Barbara will explain what she learned while working on that legislation.
Thank you very much, Barbara. The short answer is quite a bit is what I learned about that. And to be clear, it's all hazardous materials. Our focus was a lot on oil because that was where the interest started. But the position and the structure that we've set up in the State Fire Marshal's office is for the transportation of all hazardous materials by rail. So briefly, thank you indeed, Bob. I have some jotted down questions to ask you about. Well, I'll ask you afterwards when it's the question period. But so he touched a little bit, and the other thing is I can't really speak to coal because my bill was specifically about hazardous material prompted by oil. But the issue has become, it has come more to the forefront as more oil has been shipped cross-continentally, as he talked about, which was never, as Bob also mentioned, that was never the idea. The idea. Domestic oil production was always primarily about pipelines, and rail was never designed to be the primary way of shipping oil. Those pipelines were not that it was not set up to be that way. But it has increased. Some interesting numbers from 2010 to 2012. So this is a couple years ago, and like he said, this is very fluid, and it has changed a lot this year as well. The shipment of crude oil by truck went up 38%, by barge went up 53%, and by rail went up over 400%. And according to ODOT, their rail division, the number of carloads of crude oil in Oregon increased 247% from 2005 to 2013. So we're talking trains that are going through 15 Oregon counties, 35 legislative districts, 80 fire districts, and 10 of our 13 state hazardous material response team regions. So I also want to be very clear. Historically, rail has been an extremely safe way to ship things. It's an extremely safe method of shipping. Overall, derailment and train accidents have indeed decreased between 2011 and 2014. However, the number of those that involve crude oil has increased. So we certainly, there was a lot of concern about this. And the question was, so what do we do to help continue this and to lower our risk of rail incidents, including hazardous materials? Now, one of the first things that people talked to me about when I started working on this issue was, let's ban it. Let's just say that we can't run oil trains through the state. Well, that is prevented by two little things called federal preemption and the Interstate Commerce Clause. The Interstate Commerce Clause is kind of the more obvious one, which basically says that states cannot make laws that inhibit the free passage of commerce in between states. So we cannot say as a state, oh, I'm sorry, things that are shipped through or that are sold through other states have to stop at our border. We cannot do that from an Interstate Commerce Clause. And then also, interestingly, federal railroad law trumps much state policy. There's a very narrow window of things that the state is actually allowed to regulate when it comes to both interstate commerce, but then specifically railroad. So I started working on this in 2014. At the time, the biggest concern was that the feds were taking a really long time to come up with the regulations for a new, safer train car. And so I helped pass just a little kind of, honestly, kind of feel-good piece of resolution saying, hey, Federal Department of Transportation, you've been working on updating these rules for rail car safety for 4 years. Let's get moving. Let's, please try to move this forward. So as part of that, I went to a tabletop exercise that was put on by the state fire marshal, Department of Transportation, Department of Environmental Quality. All these groups came together and said, let's do some simulations of what would happen if there were a hazardous material, let's just say oil train spill or derailment or incident. And they did 2 different simulations, one where it went off, there was a derailment in Klamath Falls and a big fire, and they had a bunch of people from these communities, and they said, they walked them through, what would you do specifically? And then in the other one, it was in the gorge. And what I was struck by is the ability to plan for and have a more coordinated response was so much greater with the one in the gorge because it impacted water. And so I looked into it a little bit and discovered that that is because all those regulations on what states can and can't do about railroads, well, there's one big exemption, and it is from the 1990 Oil Pollution Act. Now, this was a bill that you may remember, a little ship called the Exxon Valdez. So in response to that enormous spill, you know, that is barges and ships were the primary way that oil was transported for many years. And so in response to that, the feds did indeed pass a law that said that it gave states specific broad authority, I want to get the words right here, to govern safety for oil transport by water. So it gave the legislative authority and the culture in which the state did its response planning, got response materials, training, collaboration. And I came out of that tabletop saying, well, why don't we just do something like that for rail? That seems, you know, it's very coordinated. There were resources in place. Why don't we do something like that for rail? So we sat down with the Legislative Council and said, okay, how do we do something like this, the Oil Pollution Act, but for rail in the state? The easiest way, and I may come back to this, the feds could help us out a lot, because the feds could pass an equivalent to the Oil Pollution Act for rail. And they could say, yes, when it comes to planning for rail transport of oil and other hazardous materials, here are, you know, the states can indeed be proactive and levy fees and all this to establish emergency response preparedness and planning. So with that caveat that the feds could do that, and that would be a very helpful thing. At the state level, we looked at it and said, okay, well, if it's the touching on water that makes us be able to be proactive about this, let's expand the definition of water so that we expanded it to, what did we do? We expanded the definition of a navigable waterway to expand our authority to develop the planning. And then we could therefore establish a revenue source by assigning to the railroads based on their number of track mile in the state. That's how we would charge that fee and then use it to do this emergency preparedness. Because again, we can't stop it at the borders. And what do we want to do? We want to make it A, so that it's the most unlikely that an incident happened, but B, that we're as prepared as possible. So, expanding the definition of navigable waterways gets you into a whole hornet's nest of things that I have only barely touched on, but it implicates a lot of other things. There's a whole bunches of DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality issues about navigation and stream abatements and setbacks from water and stuff. So basically, the short answer was that was too big of a lift for just this narrow, what we were trying to get at. So instead, we sat down with the railroads and said, hey, we're serious about this. The speaker, Tina Kotek, was very invested in this. Her district has a number of rail lines that go through it. And we were using as our guideline a report that the Oregon State Fire Marshal had conducted in 2014, where they surveyed all of the regional emergency response teams around the state and said, hey, people, how prepared are you for an incident with oil, if an incident were to happen of a rail car carrying oil and something happening? And 81% of those teams had some insufficiency, whether it was in training, personnel, materials. And so the state fire marshal did this survey and established that there were big, significant gaps in the current structure's ability to respond to an incident. So we sat down with the railroads and said, hey, we all have the same concerns about safety, because it's not good for anybody if these things happen, and we all want to be as responsible, as proactive as we can be. So what we got to was a kind of a two-part thing, an actual legislative proposal, which was the bill, House Bill 3225, significantly amended, and there was an add-on, a series of agreements with the 3 railroads that have tracks through the state, which is Union Pacific, I always say it wrong. BNSF, thank you, Burlington Northern Santa Fe, yeah, and P&W, Pacific and Western. So I do like to call out Union Pacific's leadership on this. They did a lot of spaghetti throwing about what are some different ways we can get to. Because the other thing is, as Bob mentioned, we don't have any refineries in this state. There's no end point for the oil or hazardous materials that come through our state. And what that does is keep us from being able to say, okay, well, we'll charge you a fee per gallon, per tanker, whatever it is, because there's no point in the state where it's in a refinery. We weren't able to do that the way that Washington has. So what we came up with was establishing a coordination spot through the state fire marshal, which was an organization that already not only had done this work to assess where people were, but had the confidence on both ends of the emergency responders, and the railroads were used to working with them, and the state, obviously, we have confidence in them. So what we did was we established through the state fire marshal a centralized place in which, and an agreement from the railroads to give up a lot more information than they were giving before about schedules, about what materials that they had in and across the state, where they were, where the gaps were. And so that was part of the official language. And then each railroad committed through a memorandum of understanding to contribute certain items that were found to be missing in the state fire marshal's assessment. So it was a combination of in-state trainings on oil car and other hazardous material train rollovers, sending people to a couple different training sites around the country, providing a specific rail car that can be used in those exercises, and providing more foam trailers at different locations around the state. So it was this combination of the formal legislative language that established this, gave some money to establish this, and the informal yet still memorandum of understanding that so it was the state making an investment through the state fire marshal's office, and the railroads agreeing to also put some skin in the game, to use one of my least favorite expressions, but that's what everybody says in the Capitol. It drives me crazy. You got to have some skin in the game. So we demonstrated. It was an ability to demonstrate that there was skin in the game from both sides. So it was interesting getting there. There were a number of false starts. There were indeed some efforts to perhaps wander us off into a work group, and how if we just stick with a work group for now? And we kept saying, no, we have this report from the fire marshal. We cannot say, oh, we went through a whole legislative session and we knew we had these gaps, but sorry, we can't do anything about them. So that was a really useful tool to have those. There were a couple places where there were suggested that fees come from other places in the ODOT budget, and you just recite it here. And we tried really hard to come up with a way that we could assess a straight fee to cover some of these gaps, and that wouldn't be sued. And because that's a huge thing. And if you look around at most of the legislation that's passed having to do with this in every other state, I think we're the only one who hasn't been sued out of all those states, which is kind of a big deal, because hopefully it's not, it's a show of good faith, which is important, and it hopefully will allow us to utilize this and establish. Is it perfect? No. Is there more we can do? Yes. And there's more we will continue to do. And it's still it's a pretty important step forward. It really does. Having the centralized site for the information about who has what materials where is significant. There's really a lot of useful stuff in here. Let me just take a look at my notes and see if I have missed anything else. Oh, I do just want to say once again that indeed the feds could make this a lot easier if there was federal law established that would allow us to establish fees and systems to respond to rail travel the same way that we do to the same way that we can for the water. Thank you.
We are pleased to have our next speaker here from Hood River. Laurent Picard is a fire lieutenant and a member of the Hood River City Council. He's also a member of the Safe Energy Leadership Alliance. He will speak about the impact of oil trains on public safety based on his 20 years of experience as a firefighter and as a long-time resident in the Columbia River Gorge. He will also talk about efforts at the local level to better ensure the safety of the gorge and of Portland residents. Laurent.
Thank you, Barbara. I'm not used to speaking from a mic. We don't have mics in Hood River. So yeah, I've been a firefighter for 20 years, and I've been a Hood River City Councilor for 10 years. How the years go by, and I'm also a member of the Safe Energy Leadership Conference. So I'm going to talk about I'm going to focus mostly on the safety and the risks of oil trains in general, and oil trains through the Columbia River Gorge, where I live, and I'm on the City Council in particular.
You have to point it at.
Okay. All right.
You pointed at my computer.
Thank you. It's difficult to speak realistically about the risks of Bakken oil trains in the gorge without sounding alarmist. But the truth is that these oil trains are a disaster waiting to happen. This rolling 75-mile oil pipeline through the gorge puts our communities, our first responders, and our environment at serious risk. There seems to be an assumption that federal and state regulators must have studied the dangers of oil trains, must have performed a comprehensive risk assessment to our communities, must have prepared emergency responders to deal with a derailment, explosion, or spill. Some agency must have covered all these bases prior to allowing these mile-long trains through our communities. But unfortunately, I can assure you all that there's been very limited studies and minimal to no training or preparation. We are woefully unprepared for a derailment in the gorge. The risks are clear. In, let's see. In 2008, there were 9,500 rail cars carrying oil in the country. In 2014, there were almost 400,000. As Representative Smith Warner said, that's a 4,000% increase. In the gorge in 2007, there were almost no oil trains in the gorge. In 2014, there's been 18-mile-long oil trains a week. In 2014, there was a total of 144 incidents involving oil trains, as opposed to only one in 2009. In the last 2 years, there's been 14 major spills, fires, or derailments in North America dealing with crude oil trains. 5 of these occurred in just a 1-month period in February and March of this year. The only ones to cause fires have been the ones carrying Bakken crude. Of course, many of these that don't catch fire do spill thousands of gallons of oil into our waterways and environmentally sensitive areas. This is the DOT guidebook that firefighters use when responding to hazardous materials incidents. Bakken crude is so dangerous that the regular rules that emergency responders use for evacuation don't apply. According to the DOT Emergency Response Guidebook, the Hazmat Bible for first responders, the evacuation distance for tanker cars is 0.5 miles. In a memo from Portland Fire and Rescue Hazmat Coordinator, Portland fire commanders are advised to disregard the recommended evacuation distance of ½ mile and use the guidelines for gasoline instead, which has an evacuation distance of 1 mile. One recent study shows that 25 million people nationwide live within this 1 mile evacuation zone. The blast radius in the July 2013 Lac Mégantic, Quebec derailment and explosion that killed 47 people was 0.63 miles. So even if people were evacuated to what is believed to be the proper distance from a burning oil rail car, they still could have been killed in the explosion. Lac Mégantic. This derailment set off several massive blasts, wiped out part of the downtown core. The fireball was several hundred feet tall, and waves of flaming oil flowed in every direction, including a restaurant that was full of patrons. Of the 47 people killed, 5 were never found. They were vaporized. If this happened in Washougal or Stevenson, Washington, the result would be equally catastrophic. Of course, the railroad company involved, called MMA, went under bankruptcy protection 1 month after the derailment and has gone to court to fight cleanup and the reconstruction responsibility, as well as settlement to the victims ever since. They only had $25 million of liability insurance for what is estimated to be over $1 billion in liability. That's Lac-Mégantic. About Bakken crude, what is it and why is it so volatile? Bakken crude is often referred to as light oil with more than the consistency of gasoline than the gooey stuff we think of as oil coming from the ground. When it's extracted, it's a mixture of oil and what are referred to as natural gas liquids, methane, butane, and propane. Because the oil isn't being processed properly to remove these gases, the gases form a blanket over the oil. So when a car derails and the car is breached, the gases are exposed to air and ignite, causing the huge explosions and eruptions of flaming oil that we have seen lately in Lac-Mégantic, in Alabama a few months later, in Castleton, North Dakota in December of that same year, and again in Heimdall, North Dakota in May of 2014. Because of these huge fires are impossible to extinguish, the burning cars and oil heat other cars, which are then also vulnerable, so you can have a series of fires and explosions for days. It's also possible that the slurry used to force the oil out of the shale is cross-contaminating the oil with other flammable chemicals such as isopropanol and ethylene glycol. The problem is we don't know what's in this slurry because each company has its own mixture, and these mixtures are trade secrets. And this is the stuff that BNSF is transporting on the Washington side of the gorge. Tar sands. The tar sands oil, which comprises most of the oil on the Union Pacific Railroad line on the Oregon side, is not explosive like Bakken crude, but has another issue, devastating to the environment. Tar sands, also known as oil sands, are a mixture of roughly 90% sand, clay, and water, and 10% bitumen, a thick hydrocarbon liquid. After extracting that 10% bitumen from this tar sand mixture, the bitumen can be purified and refined into synthetic crude oil. It's very thick and viscous, and unlike crude oil, when it spills in a waterway, it sinks to the bottom, making it exceedingly difficult to clean up. In July 2010, there was a 20,000-gallon tar sands oil spill in the Kalamazoo River in Michigan that shut down almost 36 miles of river to the public for 2 years. And over 2 years later, the EPA ordered Enbridge Energy back to the site for additional cleanup after Enbridge told the EPA that the cleanup was complete. Okay. In Hood River last year, our former mayor, a Harvard-educated engineer, made an exhaustive search for any assessment or study of risk that was out there, and finding none, he did his own back-of-the-envelope analysis to get a rough idea of the order of magnitude of the risk. The conclusion he came to, given average conditions, we can expect 1.2 train accidents in the gorge per year, with 6.2 cars derailed. And in February of this year, a federal DOT study estimated that oil or ethanol trains will derail an average of 10 times a year in the next 20 years, with the potential of $4 billion in damages and hundreds of deaths. Another big risk is that 80% of crude oil is transported in DOT Type 111 rail cars. These rail cars, referred to by railroad consultant Fred Millar from DC as Pepsi cans on wheels, have been deemed unsafe in derailments since 1979. The Pepsi analogy is a good one because these cars were originally designed to carry stuff like corn syrup. In 1994, 80 different hazardous materials were no longer allowed to be transported on these Type 111 cars, but they continue to be used to carry oil. These are the same cars that were involved in the Quebec explosion. But even the newer Type 1232 cars are not the answer. Of the 5 derailments since March that I mentioned, 4 of the 5 involved these 1232 cars, including the Lynchburg, Virginia derailment explosion, where 17 cars derailed, with 3 in the river, 1 on fire, and approximately 30,000 gallons of oil spilled in and around the James River, literally setting the river on fire. Railroad bridges are another huge risk. Many of these bridges are old. Many are made up of the original timber and in danger of collapse with the weight of these trains. Neither the federal nor state governments inspect these bridges. That is left to the railroads. But railroads are not required to make records of these inspections available, and they refuse to share these records. This is the International Falls Bridge in Minnesota. It was built in 1907. So our emergency responders prepared. Given the lack of an assessment of our preparedness for an oil train incident in Hood River, we prepared 19 questions that were given to every emergency response agency in the gorge. These questions were purposefully apolitical, asking the specifics of their equipment, training, and personnel. What we find in reviewing the responses was eye-opening. We found that none of the local agencies have received any special training, funding, or equipment from the railroads to help them deal with the derailment. We know it would take at least 2,000 gallons of Class B foam to apply it all at once, because you can't piecemeal it or else you break the foam barrier, to put out a small oil train fire. Local agencies in the gorge have no Class B foam. And oil train fires are so difficult to extinguish that the official BNSF policy for an oil train fire in the gorge is to let it burn. That's what a representative told us in a town meeting from BNSF in White Salmon, Washington this year. So in the fire service, we have a simple acronym called CAN, which is Conditions, Actions, and Needs. It's what firefighters do when we're in a fire and you give your report back to command about what's going on with the fire. So applying this Conditions, Actions, Needs report to a fire in downtown Hood River or Washougal, Washington, it's clear we're in trouble in the gorge. Let's go through a simplified exercise. Conditions would be massive fire, cause multiple structure fires in the vicinity of the derailment. Anybody who's been to the gorge in the summer knows that we have 30, 40 mile an hour winds blowing often, and that could cause a massive conflagration and wildland fire. If there were an explosion, we would see even more fire spread with multiple structural collapses, and we could see massive oil spills. Actions. First priority would be life safety. Next would be fire control and extinguishment. Final priority would be oil spill containment. Needs, and here is where we run into trouble, matching our needs with the resources available. An incident of this magnitude would sap emergency response resources region-wide, leaving large area of the gorge unprotected for durations of hours to days. An example, May of 2011, Portland Fire and Rescue responded to a train derailment which caused a fire in a car carrying ethanol with a fire impingement on 13 additional cars. This was in an isolated area off Highway 30, so the main issue was keeping the fire from making the other tankers exploding. To do this required 15 fire engines, 6 ladder trucks, 9 chief officers, 11 water tenders, 1 foam unit, not to mention the existence of 13 other local, state, and federal responders, 110 total personnel. Again, this is a fire in 1 train car. In Washougal, Washington, there are a total of 44 career firefighters. In Hood River, we have 13. So that's the fire there. So briefly, with our needs, we need to treat and transport the injured. We don't have the resources to treat or transport hundreds of people. Evacuation, we have no region-wide plan, nor have we trained until recently for this scenario. Fire extinguishment of surrounding structures, unlikely, because we'd be too preoccupied with injured and evacuations. And fire extinguishment, we'd have to let it burn because we have no foam. And spill response, local agencies have no booming to contain the oil in the river, none. So what do I think needs to happen? First, I agree with Mayor Clinton of Bend when he suggests that there should be a fee on shipments of hazardous materials to raise money for governments to prepare for incidents such as oil train fires. I also agree with the mayor when he says that this risk should not be totally handled by the public when it's essentially a private industry activity. I think the railroads and the oil industry needs to step up and help local governments with our preparations for an oil train incident. So far, despite the assurances I have read from the railroads and the oil industry and the press, we have learned from our survey that they have failed to help local governments in any meaningful way. I also agree with and applaud the Gorge Commission's 2014 resolution. That's the bi-state agency that governs the Columbia River Gorge Scenic Area. They did a resolution asking Oregon and Washington to impose a moratorium on Bakken oil trains in the gorge until a comprehensive risk assessment is completed and emergency response plans enacted. In Hood River, City Council passed a resolution against oil trains, and just last week, Portland City Council did the same. Although these resolutions are largely symbolic, they're still helpful in making our voices heard. New federal regulations as of June 2014 require us to be informed of the estimated volume and frequency of train traffic involving 1 million gallons or more of oil in a single train. This is a step in the right direction, but does not help us with risk assessment or the nuts and bolts of emergency response. The railroad and oil companies are working overtime to prevent new regulations from taking effect. And these are companies that do billions of dollars of business every year. They've already successfully succeeded in gutting Oregon House Bill 3225. I was at the hearing, and they were there in opposition to Representative Smith Warner. And that would have and the original bill would have provided $400,000 a year of funding from the railroads, and now there's nothing. They are also working to gut new federal regulations requiring more efficient braking systems on trains. The American Petroleum Institute spends $200 million a year on lobbying, and the American Association of Railroads spends $50 to $60 million a year. Interestingly, the railroads would love for the feds to mandate safer cars tomorrow, but the oil companies who own the cars don't want to pony up the $3 billion costs. So lobbyists delay and circumvent the rules, that would mandate safer rail cars. And now lobbyists are saying that 2018, the year that Type 111 cars are supposed to be phased out under federal guidelines, is unrealistically early date. And I see that my time is up. I apologize. I've only done this presentation once before, so I wasn't sure of my timing.
It was fine. It was very helpful. Thank you.
Robert gave you 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Laurent. There are a lot of questions, obviously, brewing just in what we've heard so far, but we will go on to our fourth speaker before we have interaction amongst the speakers and questions from the audience. If you do have questions burning, you can get an index card and submit them. Our final speaker is Catherine Mader, who traveled here from Corvallis. Catherine's an expert in sustainable forestry and conservation issues. She has a master's degree in civil engineering from OSU. She's president of Mader Engineering and senior fellow of the Pinchot Institute for Conservation in Washington, D.C. She's been a commissioner on the Oregon Economic Development Commission, currently serves on the Oregon Global Warming Commission, and is the immediate past chair of the Oregon Transportation Commission, where she voted against a grant that would have funded building a new coal transfer dock at the Port of St. Helens. She will discuss issues associated with both coal and oil transport on our rails and waterways. Catherine.
Great. Thank you so much, Barbara. Don't you just feel totally empowered to be able to have solution to all these problems after listening to everybody? You know, it's just like this overwhelming, thing that you just can't get your hands on and figure out what's the critical path. What do you got to do first, second, and third, and how do you shore up and steel up for the arguments, because that's exactly what you need to do. I know that before accepting the post as chair of the Oregon Transportation Commission, I was 6'1". I'm now 5'2", and so, that works. Believe me, you take hits, and they are hard hits in the process. What I thought I would do is step back from all of this and kind of give you an overview, and I like to see optically, all of these facts and statistics that are circulating around, but stepping back from it, what's the larger picture? What does it really look like? What are the optics on this? So I'm going to concentrate first on coal. And I think everyone, especially Bob, probably laid the argument out quite well. I believe the debate's over with coal in Oregon. I'll have a caveat to that as I go to the next slide. But, you know, with everything that's happened, Oregon's been one of the few states in the nation that has really stepped forward with regard to greenhouse gas emissions and making a decision to close the Boardman facility. I mean, we've been ahead of the game, ahead of the mark. Amber Energy, as you heard earlier, really tried very, very hard. In fact, it was called the zombie project because it just wouldn't die. It kept coming back up and coming back up. But at the end of the day, I think it's like this, right? Oregon is like on the leading edge within the United States as a top state. The new EPA Clean Power Act that was just introduced a month ago, which places provisions for a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions across all states across the United States. For Oregon, that requirement will be a 48% reduction from 2005 greenhouse gas emissions. And guess what? We're almost there. I think we're like 2 or 3% short. So again, we're well ahead of the game at national scale, you know, really setting the standard, I think, out front. However, going back to the Amber Energy project, this next month, that decision at the Port of Morrow, so let's get the logistics here, coming from Balkan area, North Dakota, being shipped by rail and then transloaded at the Port of Morrow and then barged down to the Port of St. Helens, transloaded again to Panamax vessels that go out to mostly to Asia in this particular case. But even with the denial of the permit at the Boardman facility and the twice denial from the Oregon Department of Transportation Commission at Port of St. Helens, that denial was appealed by Amber Energy. We will know the decision of that appeal actually next month. There are no real infrastructure improvements that are required, so if that permit is approved at the Port of Morrow, you can immediately expect about 8 million more tons of coal per year by rail and barge just through the Columbia River Gorge alone. So yes, coal is, I think, off Oregon's plate, but we still, you know, we still have to pay attention to residual effects on that. Well, what about oil? Well, you've heard it over and over again as we've sat here, but again, I wanted you to see the optic of what's really happening because, and I'm sorry this is light, but the reality is that up until 2012, those levels of transport by rail of oil tankers was fairly level. It had a slight incline. It was really in 2012, and look what happened, man. It just blew the socks off, and that is scheduled to continue. So that optic, I think, is a very telling lesson as we look at this. But here it is by the numbers, and you've heard it before, but I'll underscore it. Representative Barbara Smith-Warner certainly indicated right at the beginning where all of these trains are really being shipped to. But I think people don't quite understand. We get the Columbia River Gorge that gets all of the attention and kind of gets the impact. But quietly throughout all of this, you've got multiple millions of barrels that are going through Salem, that are going through Eugene, going through Klamath Falls, going through Bend, many other places, many rural places in Oregon. 250% increase in oil haul just through that short stretch of the Scappoose, Portland, St. Helens, Rainier alone. A 58% increase in oil hauled tankers through Central Oregon in the Bend area. In fact, now the amount of oil tankers that goes through Bend equals 23% of all of the state's total volume of oil transferred by rail, which is actually pretty surprising. And again, just looking at the projected shipments through the Columbia River Gorge, we've all said it, 600%, 700% if things go through. Actually, we'll look and see what that might look like if the Tesoro project goes through in Washington, which is a huge deal right now. So this I always find very helpful. This is really created by Dr. Mark Trexler, he's kind of a guru in climate change here in the Pacific Northwest, and he kind of created this visual for me and identified this phrase of willful blindness, because I think what's happening in Oregon now with all of the impact that we see across the board, we're having unintended results, and I'm going to show you some of those, and we clearly have willful blindness about what's really happening and what we ought to be doing, and this sense of helplessness. So, the bottom line is put coal aside, because now even coal can't compete with oil. It's being pushed aside by oil. Oil really has taken over the rails in the state of Oregon, and it has done so nationally. In fact, the problem has become so pronounced that you have major efforts back in Washington, D.C., because oil now, as a priority product, it's a high-value commodity product. All the ag products, wood products, all of the other commodity products get pushed to the side. So if you have an oil train that is scheduled to go through and you've got a conflict with agricultural product or wood products or other products, those trains get pulled to the side, and they have to let the oil trains go through first as a top priority. Nationally, and this is last year, I don't even know what it is this year, we don't really have a grasp of this in Oregon, which I think we have to get a handle on. But nationally, about $100 million in loss per year in many states and agricultural states because of at least a 2-week product shipment delays due to oil shipment priority. And then you've got the tankers on the other end, $30,000 to $50,000 a day holding until they get the products to be able to send out. The commodities, if they can't do it, if the shipments are just too long, and many of them are, they have to shift those commodities over to truck traffic. Well, what do you think that's doing to our road network? So if you take like a 100-unit grain train that we have in Oregon, and you have to reshift that over to our road networks, that's about 400 highway truckloads of grain that are hitting our roads that weren't part of that demand and that impact on our road network currently. And this is all, this is market demand, right? We're not going to have an impact on this per se legislatively, but you need to understand what the market is doing here. So even in the cost of rail car access, I mean, you've got major increases from $700 a rail car to now $6,000 a rail car. So again, the oil companies can absolutely afford to pay this. Agricultural companies and other companies that have typically shipped by rail, they're caught. They're just caught in the shorts. And even when you think about, because this has really happened, I mean, your average train speed in Oregon going through Scappoose, for example, used to be at about 35 miles per hour. That, as a result of the oil shipments to date, that's actually reduced down to about 20 miles per hour, and that slowed reaction in and of itself has created, again, congested trouble in terms of lead times that are set aside for these lower value commodity products that are trying to hit the rail. So all of these unintended results, that are really happening. February of this year, President Obama is talking to KGW TV, and what he's stressing is the great urgency to improve safety regulations in our oil trains and improve highway congestion. In fact, he received a report it was jointly done by the Oregon Department of Transportation and Metro that clearly identified Oregon really at great risk right now with regard to competitive edge in all markets, because we have such congested highways right now that it's really causing additional costs and we're becoming non-competitive. A couple of months ago, April 2015, this is amazing to me. This is just amazing to me. This transfer of congestion and delay of shipments has become so paramount in the United States that the U.S. Department of Ag stated that the disruptions to agricultural shipments alone due to oil demand now far exceeds all disruptions caused by Hurricane Katrina. So if you can kind of get that grasp in your head, this is just huge stuff. So what can we do? Well, and this will be a little contentious, but I believe you can't handle everything, and yes, we have to deal with the federal regulation. That's going to take time to be able to do it. But I think there are a couple of things we can do, and we can do fairly quickly, that can have impact. And all of it means you got to follow the money and you got to impact the money. So the first thing I'm going to suggest is that we need to Connect Oregon. And doing it now, Connect Oregon, don't get me wrong. How many know what that is? Okay, all right. So I know you guys do. So with all the lottery dollars that are garnered in the state of Oregon, when that money comes in, it gets apportioned out to different agencies, and there's a formula that's set aside on where that money goes. This is not a small hit. This is in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So typically, a portion from these lottery funds go into a statutory program called Connect Oregon. And a lot of places throughout the state of Oregon go after grants from this particular pool of money to be able to help them do infrastructure projects. Well, right now within Connect Oregon, what we have are projects that are partnered, right? This is exactly what happened in St. Helens. So you have these fossil fuel projects and these oil and coal projects. The companies come in and they'll say, look, you know, if you do 40%, you ask the state for 40% financing through Connect Oregon, we'll pick up 60% of the cost, and then we'll go ahead and contribute $1.6 million to your schools over the next 3 years, you know, as part of the process. I mean, these are, and believe me, I work in the wood products industry. I know what it's like to work in really economically depressed communities. So these really sound, you know, like a great deal to these communities. But what are we doing here, right? So on the one end, we've got Oregon leading the nation in climate change and the clean energy plan in terms of what we're showing as a priority project. And on the other hand, we're allowing public funds to be used to finance coal projects and oil projects in the state of Oregon. So there are no limitations within Connect Oregon that disallow the use of public funds for projects that partner with fossil fuel partners. I think that can be done, and it can be done very effectively, frankly, by initiating a statutory criteria change that would prohibit the use of those public funds for fossil fuel partnership projects. It's not, these companies are going to do these projects anyway. They really don't need the state to step in and spend the money that we are talking about. It means a lot to us as a state, but I just don't think public funds should be used for these projects. And this is a very elegant, simple, and I think relatively fast way that you could start to get at this. The second thing that we can start to do is look at competing payments within government agencies. Boy, you sit back and I think about you folks in the legislature, and I know you got a lot of stuff, you know, thrown at you all the time, but then I see stuff like this. So, okay. So right now in the Oregon Department of Transportation, I mean, within the budget of ODOT, you have a fairly good allocation of funding. It used to be at $10 million, actually more, to help pay for passenger rail. Is that a good thing? Yeah, we want to get people off the roads and get them to be able to use, you know, passenger rail. At the same time, you've got a 19%, this is just in Oregon, you've got a 19% drop in ridership, resulting in large part due to delayed arrival times by Amtrak. So here we are plowing, I think the last appropriation has been $5 million going into Amtrak to kind of keep it alive, and at the same time, we're paying for projects through Connect Oregon to allow oil companies, you know, basically to utilize the rails that create the delays for Amtrak. We have emergency responder preparedness. Department of Environmental Quality has just reduced the budget to be able to train people to do these kind of response preparative activities, and at the same time, we have such a crying, urgent need to do that. So these competing payments within government, they're really important to get a handle on. You just target 2 or 3 and be able to kind of reduce what I think is the money drain that's happening with these kind of competing payments. And third, I guess everyone else has talked about this a little bit in some way, shape, or form, but I believe, Oregon I don't believe is ready for an overall carbon tax. I think they are really ready for a real fossil fuel carbon surcharge. And there's no better time actually to look at it than right now. Next month, and I've been actually back in DC working with the White House on some of this, but you've got this big climate change summit that's happening with all the world leaders. Who would have thought that a few months ago, Europe's biggest oil and gas companies have formally requested to all the top leaders of this climate summit to impose and identify an international price on fossil fuel carbon. Shell and BP are among those requesting this carbon price determination. Exxon refused to sign the letter. But who would have thought that all of a sudden you'd have all these major players, and they're typically the oil companies, that are now requesting that that price be established and be established quickly. Their thinking is, if we're not part of the climate, if we're not at the climate table, we're going to be part of the climate meal, and I think that that's probably right. So what better time for Oregon to be able to take a look at that propitious timing of what's happening on a national scale, where you've got that real leadership relative to greenhouse gas reduction on the leading edge, and really make a difference with that. And I think the final thing here, it's almost more of a personal comment here, but you know, this kind of issue, you kind of think you know what people are thinking, and from their backgrounds on how they might think about this. Before the Pope issued his encyclical on climate change, I guess that was about 4 or 5 months ago, I was back in Washington, D.C., and I was meeting with the head of the Catholic Climate Covenant in D.C. And we had this just marvelous 2-hour conversation out at American University. And he sat back and he said, who do you think are the strongest detractors to the Pope putting out this environmental encyclical? And I thought for a minute, and maybe it was only like 30 seconds. I said, it's got to be some of these old codgers who are cardinals and monsignors. You know, they just don't like change happening. And he said, you know, you're absolutely wrong. He said, our biggest detractors are the young priests coming in. And his rationale for that was that a lot of these young people are coming in, they come from more well-heeled families, whereas the older priests used to be very connected and their families were connected with the earth. And so, you know, again, putting aside your kind of assumptions on who you think might be great kind of collaborators in what you're trying to do, I think is always real important. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, all of our speakers. That was a lot of information, and some of it seemingly contradictory. So I want to just ask a couple of just factual questions so we get clear what we're talking about, and then I will let you all question each other. But one of the things we heard was that the number of oil trains is reducing now. I think I heard that from you, Bob, and yet I heard from everyone else that it's increasing dramatically. So I think we need to clarify that one thing first.
Okay, it's reducing. It's down about 25% from a year ago. The reason why is that 75% of the oil that's in oil trains is Bakken crude. And North Dakota has opened up a pipeline in February and a refinery in May, and so they're not shipping as much by rail. There's other fields in that general area apparently that also ship by rail too. And as these fields develop, a lot of people don't understand this about oil. It's not about drilling a well and finding the oil. You got to get it somewhere, and the infrastructure for getting it somewhere is really a big investment, and that investment is taking place because remember, it's only been about 5 years since that field's been developed. So it has come down a lot, and oil is what is oil and oil products are a little over 2% of all the rail traffic in the United States.
So I want to stick with, I think Laurent said that the Bakken, the oil trains carrying the Bakken crude were on the Washington side, and on the Oregon side is from the tar sands in Alberta. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Laurent?
Yes. And on that point, you know, Bob's correct. I haven't looked at the latest statistics. I was operating from 2008, comparing that to 2014.
And yes, Catherine.
I just wanted to point out, I don't know how I missed the slide, but I did. But I want you to take a look at the latest report, August 2015, that shows, and this, of course, is combining in the region, Oregon, Washington, B.C. Don't believe for a minute that we're on a downturn with the oil train. It is going to be explosive. And in fact, according to Reuters results, if we were to count for all of the proposed, newly permitted, and projects that are in permit process right now, and those projects go through, basically they're the equivalent of more than 5 Keystone Pipeline projects in terms of greenhouse gas emissions.
So just to clarify, though, if I understand, no one is claiming that the use of gasoline or oil in the state of Oregon has increased. So it is the transport through the state of Oregon to refineries somewhere else that is accounting for whatever increase there might be. Correct?
The use of oil and gas in Oregon has increased. Gasoline consumption's up. It just is. The economy's stronger. There's more people. These trains are, the one that goes to Clatskanie, that was an old ethanol producing plant. I was asked to do the impact study for them. They were taking grain and producing ethanol as alternative fuel. They got a lot of state funding for it. It didn't make any economic sense to me. I didn't know why they even did it. They shut it down in less than a year, and I guess one of the trains caught fire, but they converted it to shipping, bringing in oil, and I don't know why it would be tar sands, but I don't know, but shipping the oil and then putting it on barges, I assume, and bringing it up to Anacortes or down to California. There's a lot of oil and gas shipped by barge. That's why gasoline's expensive on the Oregon coast. It comes in by barge, or Eastern Oregon, it comes in by barge. It's been like that for decades.
And if I could just briefly say, just to kind of combine those. Yes, all the numbers that we are using are through 2014, and in 2015, as Bob said, you know, the oil and gas economy is very fluid, very price sensitive. And so indeed, shipments have dropped as the price of oil and gas have gone down. So yes, there are fewer in 2015 than 2014, but the numbers we were all using were through 2014. And I would say even with it dropped in 2015, it's still probably significantly higher than it was in 2008, 2007. Mm-hmm. And all that movement has little to do with use in Oregon, because it's all transit. It's all going through to somewhere else.
And there's a question from the audience that seems very relevant here, that can any of you, and I think this would most likely be directed at Bob, but any of you make a case for oil trains in Oregon as a business boon for the state of Oregon? Is there any way in which this brings value added to our state, or are we just a transit point?
You know, I'll do it. I know this is going to be unpopular. I do work with Ironworkers Union, and a lot of the construction of energy projects hires a lot of these union workers. And exporting a product has a very high multiplier effect. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be wheat. It could be a petroleum product of some sort. Produces a lot of money for the economy because it brings new money into the state, and that's what drives the economy. So you can easily make a case it would be a significant job creator.
You're talking about the terminal, though, right?
Well, you could do any number of things. You could, I don't know, the terminal itself, it would employ a lot of people. Shipping is a big high-paid jobs. We're talking about six-figure plus blue-collar jobs. There aren't that many of them. Rail jobs are very high-paid jobs. And again, they're blue-collar jobs. These are the working family jobs everybody wants. That's where they are. It's an industry. You can make cases for, I suppose at some point, someone will develop plants to produce chemicals of various types. We have one that produced ethanol, which is an alternative fuel. It's basically vodka, by the way. It's an interesting story. When I started graduate school in '76, really old, I was in mineral economics at Penn State, and that was a time when everyone was talking about peak oil, and all the professors there would roll their eyes at this because they heard this all before in the 50s. And they say, you'll never hear it again. And I heard it again. But at that time, there was Jimmy Carter was pushing ethanol production, huge subsidies, build ethanol plants. And they all went bankrupt, all of them. And what was interesting is, by the way, ethanol on trains is a lot more ethanol carried than crude oil, way more, causing much more traffic, I'm sure. But one guy took one of these old ethanol plants and didn't produce vodka. He made it into a distillery.
All right, away from vodka for a moment. Catherine. Right.
Yeah, I think
later for that. Catherine, you wanted to speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll play the devil's advocate here. Frankly, the infrastructure improvements that are being requested by the rail companies, those same infrastructure improvements are going to benefit a lot of different industries in Oregon. So, the improvements will benefit when the wood products are shipped on those rails, as it will the agricultural products. So, I think you have to separate out what's appropriate for public dollars and what's going to happen anyway relative to improvement. And then I think, as I said before, I don't think public funds should be used for this where you're in partnership with it. But at the same time, those projects are going to happen. And so does it make sense to try and capture a carbon surcharge from these companies that can then go back and pay for exactly the services that we're talking about and benefit further these rural communities where you have all this transport through? I mean, I think that just makes good sense to do that. It's going to happen, so we just need to be smart on how we put it together.
And I will add that labor in Washington at least is not united on these projects. The ILWU, the International Longshoremen's and Warehouse Union, Local 4 in Vancouver, has come out for years in opposition to the oil terminal in Vancouver.
Yeah.
Do any of you have questions for each other based on the presentations that you made before I go back to other questions from the audience?
I have a question, and this is for Laurent. I understand the danger, and the Bakken crude has a lot of dissolved propane in it, I think. I'm not sure, but I think it does. And that's because they don't know what to do with the propane that they produce because they've lacked pipelines. Nobody flares gas at oil wells anymore except in North Dakota because they don't have the infrastructure to move it to make plastics or whatever you do with propane. But when I looked at the railroad statistics this morning, I was amazed at, even though you talk about the big increase in crude oil, and it's all from this Bakken area, and it's about 800,000 barrels a day or something like that. It's still really, really small. It's 1 out of every 50 rail cars. What's the much bigger category, in fact, oil is in the other section, are chemicals. There's huge quantities of chemicals and other things. Ethanol is not that's grain alcohol. Other things that cause big fires. Doesn't that concern you? I mean, it's something like 23% of the rail traffic is chemicals.
Yeah, that's a common argument, and it's often used to, in my experience, to deflect away from the danger of the rail cars. There are, of course, many dangerous chemicals that are could be more deadly than crude oil, but the issue is it's, at least in Oregon and in the gorge, is the massive increase in volume. When you're seeing a 4,000% increase in traffic, that's what we're concerned about. It's just a multiplier, and I'm not seeing communities devastated by exploding chlorine tankers. You look nationwide, and we're just seeing Bakken crude tanker after Bakken crude tanker exploding and spilling, and we're not seeing it with other substances in the same amounts and incidents. But so it's a matter of volume. When you have that much more coming through of explosive oil, that's the concern. But surely there are other just as dangerous chemicals, if not more so.
You can.
I recall quite a few dangerous chemical fires that didn't involve oil. There was one in Tennessee recently. So I just think it's, I'm not trying to argue.
Oh, I know.
I agree with you.
Oh, yeah.
I think you should be prepared.
But were there 5 in a 2-month period of those?
Okay. I think we don't want to get too far down into those weeds, but I think one of the questions we have, and one of the interesting questions, is would pipelines be much safer? And how ironic, given that the fight has been against the Keystone XL pipeline has just been, at least temporarily, won in the sense that it's not happening. But would that be a safer way to transport all of this oil that we're now worried about having traveling through our state? Does anyone want to answer that?
But pipelines are safer. They're not zero risk. In the last 10 years, been 12,000 miles of crude oil pipeline built in the United States, 25,000 miles of liquids pipeline. That would be things like propane, ethane, rather, not ethanol. And it's a huge amount of pipelines. It's difficult to go through all the permitting and building a pipeline. Keystone was more politicized, but there's plenty of pipelines being built, and they are relatively safe, but they're not risk-free. None of this stuff is risk-free, which, you got to always put that in perspective. I mean, it's the cost of energy, I guess.
Another question was between the what Representative Smith Warner said and what Laurent Picard had to say. Has the legislation that passed improved the situation significantly, or does it need a lot of ramping up? And I think we heard two different things.
Well, I mean, it did just, session just ended in July, and honestly, the one drawback of housing this in the state fire marshal's office is they are, completely consumed by fire season every summer. And they have explicitly said, we are a little behind on this because, we got our, we were really knocked out by fire season this year once again. So in the short term, probably not yet. And one thing I'll comment on is the conflicting reports of indeed the preparedness levels in the gorge. I believe what you are saying, and I also know that I've been told by railroads and other people in other communities that there are that has been training, and that there is more equipment and foam and et cetera. Like the concept that there is no foam whatsoever in the gorge, that is, that is contrary to what I have been told.
Yeah, we surveyed every department in the entire gorge, and none of the departments carry Class B foam. I applaud what you did, Barbara. I really do. It's a tough row to hoe with these people. What does it say about the railroads that they sue everybody else than us? And I was in there, in that room testifying, and I saw them opposing you. And the CEO of Union Pacific came in one of their luxury rail cars with mahogany and brass to Hood River to talk to us. I said, "This is crazy. What are they doing coming to Hood River?" And the CEO of Union Pacific, and they had a fancy meal served by people who called me sir. And I sat down with the fancy silver. It was nice. It was a nice breakfast. They told us that there's really no problem with oil by rail, and it's only the people on the West Coast who complain. And on the East Coast, there's no concerns, and what's the big deal? The legislation was watered down to the point where it's completely ineffectual on a practical basis.
Well, I have to unfortunately leave it there, which I think could only say that we have lots of work to do. Thank you all very much for a really helpful discussion. This concludes the recorded part of our panel discussion. Thank you very much again to the panel for providing us with all of this information. A list of some of the organizations working on these issues is in the programs that we distributed, also available on the website lwvpdx.org, where you'll also find the schedule for the Metro East Community Media rebroadcast, and you'll be able to find a YouTube recording of this should you want to watch it yet again. And I want to thank you, our donors, the Multnomah Bar Foundation and the Ethel Noble Memorial Bequest. And thank you to the audience and to all of our volunteers. One last thing, on February 9th in 2016, we'll present the next free public information program in this series. It'll focus on funding for K through 12 public schools. It's called Great Schools, Great Communities. Will be presented in partnership with the League of Women Voters of Oregon, the Oregon Education Association, the Confederation of Oregon School Administrators, and the Oregon Center for Public Policy. So we hope you'll attend that. This program tonight was a production of Metro East Community Media and the League of Women Voters of Portland Education Fund and the Portland branch of the American Association of University Women. Thank you all again.